the 20th century, science developed at a spectacular pace in almost all fields. Tremendous advances were made in engineering, space exploration, and the military. Although the most fundamental discoveries were made in chemistry and biology, developments in this direction have improved the quality of medicine, which has had a positive effect on life expectancy and the general well-being of the population of all countries around the world. But not everyone wanted to use the achievements for good purposes. After all, it was in the 20th century that geopolitical instability reached its highest level, culminating in two of the largest military confrontations, called World Wars. Empires collapsed one after another, so the inevitable consequence was an insane arms race, not only on the technical level, but also on the chemical and biological level. The creation of the most fearful unit in the history of Japan. Emperor Hirohito, the land of the rising sun, had chosen the motto Showa, literally translated as Age of Enlightenment, from the very beginning of his reign. The monarch himself had a great love for the natural sciences and had a brilliant education in biology and even had a degree and several publications of his own. At the same time, he watched with dismay the political upheavals taking place in the outside world. He witnessed the simultaneous collapse of four very powerful empires that had defined international politics for centuries. In some of them, the destruction of monarchism was accompanied by the destruction of the ruling dynasty. Hirohito, himself under the strong influence of the military junta, which significantly limited his power, understood that he was also not immune to possible overthrow. In order to hold on to power much more firmly, he obviously needed loyal allies. That said, nothing like a victorious war to strengthen the current government. And here, right in front of us, is the Russian Empire, smoking in ruins, which was just being formed into the Soviet Union. But it was still too early to start a war against the USSR, especially since Japan was deeply entangled in constant military skirmishes with China. And then Manchuria came along just in time. This puppet state, created by Japanese politicians and the military, was a great place for various experimentation tests. As the 30s rolled on, the Japanese also watched closely the rebuilding of the German war machine. Gradually it became clear that a confrontation between the Germany and the USSR was inevitable. The Japanese were waiting for the war to begin, so they could get involved and reclaim the eastern territories of the USSR they had long desired. But soon it became crystal clear to Hirohito and his samurai that the level of industrialization of the Soviet Union and the Third Reich was beyond their reach, which would simply make their participation in the war pointless. It was here that the emperor recalled his old hobby. One of the most prominent military figures, Lieutenant General Shiroishi, was summoned to the imperial palace and given clear instructions there. Without wasting time, he went to Manchuria as part of a 3,000-strong military unit. The detachment's task number 1 was to create a secret biological complex and subsequently continually fill it with test material in the form of local residents. Experiments on them were to be conducted by the best specialists in all medical and biological fields, who were called Unit 731. General Shiroishi was a soldier who could carry out orders quickly and efficiently. A site on the territory of a residential settlement was chosen for the structures. The problem was solved quickly. On the general's orders, the settlement was scorched to the ground, and it was more than 300 yards, and the locals were exterminated. Then construction began immediately. Things moved quickly, and in 1936 a complex of intimidating buildings, stuffed to the brim with all kinds of medical and biological equipment, appeared on the territory of the former Chinese settlement. At the same time, the first units of the Unit 731 were sent to the factory. The go-ahead from Tokyo was received, and the Death Factory began its terrifying work. The Hell Slayer. Biological studies were conducted in different areas, each with its own specialists. The scope of research was tremendous, and as a consequence, more and more research material was needed, but there was never a shortage. Shiroishi's disciplined soldiers provided the right amount of people for these experiments. The inhumanity and indifference to the unfortunates, who were called nothing but logs, is truly striking. The ideology of the Japanese taught them to treat the Chinese population worse than cattle, and there was no compassion either for women, children, or the elderly. And at the same time, the Chinese government simply turned a blind eye to the genocide of its own people. And what was going on in the laboratory's chambers could not be called anything other than extremely brutal genocide. When scientists bred a new plague strain, they infected people with it, and then conducted autopsies on them while they were still alive to see how their bodies reacted. Naturally, anesthesia was out of question because it would interfere with the natural conduct of the experiment. The lucky ones were mockingly called those on whom poisonous gases were tested, as they died instantly and almost painlessly. Many other trials were worse than medieval tortures. But how was the plague transmitted? The test subjects were taken to the range, stripped naked, wrapped in thick blankets, leaving only their buttocks bare. Metal helmets were put on their heads and tied to poles. Such outfit, according to Japanese doctors, was supposed to protect the so-called logs from injuries during the bombing raids. The planes dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague fleas in the area of the people tied to the poles, each containing up to 30,000 fleas. For 5 hours, people were left tied up alone with plague fleas. Then the subjects were returned to the unit's prison, where the experimenters watched as the people turned into black mummies within 2 or 3 days. For example, here's the recollections of one of the participants. 10 Chinese military prisoners were tied to poles 10-20 meters away from a shrapnel bomb contaminated with gas gangrene. After the current was turned on, the bomb exploded, filling the area where the test subjects were placed with shrapnel-containing gas gangrene bacteria. As a result, all the test subjects were wounded in the legs or buttocks and died in agony within 7 days. And this is how the infection process is described. Infection of people was done by mouth, by injections, by means of insects in laboratories, and in experimental field locations. The so-called logs were infected with the plague not only with ceramic bombs. The plague vaccine was injected directly into the subject's blood, or they were treated with pies stuffed with plague or typhoid bacteria, or they might give out watermelons or melons filled with paratyphoid bacteria. Some didn't die immediately. They screamed and banged on the steel cell doors, made a terrific roll, and ripped their chests open. After use, the so-called logs were disposed of, if being more precise, mostly burned in stoves. Japanese doctors also performed autopsies on living people. The next text which we will show you is from memory. We were given the task of removing appendicitis from 2 living men. At that time, in the Japanese army, many soldiers were dying of appendicitis attacks. These surgeries were poorly performed at the time. With me in the operating room were 5 of my companions, and each of us made a different incision on the body of the subjects in search of appendicitis. When the appendix was removed, we were told to remove people's livers, kidneys, spleen. One subject, a peasant, had already died by that time, and the other, a young communist, continued to breathe, despite the fact that air had already been injected into his heart. Elimination of the project. The success of the laboratory experiments encouraged the Japanese government to begin building biological weapons to be used against the United States and the Soviet Union. Based on available data, General Shiroishi reported to the emperor that the necessary number of weapons would be ready by 1945. In the meantime, Germany was to thoroughly incapacitate the Allies. But this didn't happen. The defeat of the fascists forced the Japanese government to reconsider its plans. Prime Minister Toshiro did everything he could to dissuade the emperor and his advisors from using arms. The far-sighted politician was already well aware that Japan would not win the war in any way, and retaliation from the Allies could bring devastating consequences. Project Unit 731 has been shut down. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe for more and leave a like.